This might be the one that gets me kicked off this platform. So I'm going to be graphic. It is what it is. Let's talk. Because this week something happened that took us about 400 years to get to. And before I tell you what was said, I need to tell you what was being named. Because this is the part that never gets said with the weight that it deserves. Before a single ship left the coast of West Africa, the people who were going to be put on it were already being processed, stripped naked, prodded, groped. Traders invasively examined the breast, buttocks, and vaginal areas of women and girls, allegedly to assess their childbearing ability. Men and boys were groped around the groin, scrotum, and anus. One white trafficker who later testified described the process as similar to what you would do to a horse before purchasing it. These were human beings, y'all. They were being evaluated the way that you would evaluate livestock. And when the evaluation was done, they were assigned a number, not a name, a number, and loaded onto ships. These ships were built into two categories: tight packers and loose packers. Tight packers maximized profit. Human beings were measured with instruments with charts to calculate how many bodies could be chained in a single row. The space allocated per person was roughly the size of a coffin. Men were shackled together in pairs at the wrists and ankles and packed into the hold lying on their sides, unable to sit up, unable to turn over, unable to move. The heat in the hold was lethal and suffocating. There was almost no ventilation. The air was so thick with human waste, sweat, and disease that sailors reported being unable to breathe when they opened the hatch. Dysentery tore through entire decks. People vomited on each other. People had diarrhea on each other. People died chained to the person beside them and stayed there, rotting, until someone came to remove the body. Sometimes that took days. Smallpox spread. Measles spread. The living were chained to the dead in spaces the size of coffins, in heat that historians describe as suffocating and unbearable. In the middle of the ocean, women were kept unchained in separate compartments, not as mercy, but because being unchained made them easier to access. Crew members raped them throughout the voyage, not occasionally, routinely. Those who resisted were flogged. Women gave birth on those ships, without medical care, without assistance. In those conditions, most newborns didn't survive. In one documented case, a captain punished a failed rebellion by killing one of the men involved immediately and forcing two other enslaved people to eat his heart and liver, while the rest watched. This is in the historical record, y'all. It is documented in historical accounts of the Middle Passage. About 15% of the people put on those ships, nearly 2 million human beings, died before they reached land. They were thrown overboard, and some were thrown overboard alive because maritime insurance paid for cargo lost at sea, not cargo that died of illness. Throwing people into the ocean alive was more profitable than letting them die of disease. The most documented case is the Zong Massacre of 1781, in which a British captain threw 132 enslaved people into the ocean alive and filed an insurance claim. The case went to court. The question before the court wasn't whether a crime had been committed, though. The question was whether the insurance policy covered the loss. The ones who survived the crossing arrived at a port and then were processed again. Before they were sold, their skin was rubbed with oil to disguise cracking and lesions. Their heads were sometimes shaved to remove gray hairs and bacteria, to make them look younger and healthier than they actually were. They were examined again by buyers, poked, prodded, molested. George Washington, who would become the first president of the United States, specified in writing in 1772 that he preferred enslaved people not exceeding 20 years of age. He was placing an order for human beings, like you would place an order for food, and the ones who were purchased were put to work. About 80% of enslaved Africans transported across the Middle Passage ended up on sugar plantations in South America and the Caribbean, where the mortality rate was so high that the entire enslaved population had to be continuously replaced through the ongoing slave trade. People worked from before dawn until after dark, in gangs, cutting sugarcane in tropical heat. Feeding it into mills regularly took fingers, hands, and arms. Life expectancy on a sugar plantation was measured in years, not decades. The system consumed people. That was the model. You work them to death and then you buy more. In the United States, enslaved people were raped systematically by the men who owned them, by overseers, by anyone the law permitted. And when those rapes produced children, those children were born enslaved. The enslaver's blood ran through the veins of the people that he owned. Families were deliberately separated at auction. Children sold away from mothers, husbands sold away from wives, with the specific intention that they would never find each other again. Their languages were criminalized. Their religions were outlawed. Their names were replaced with the names of the men who owned them. Reading and writing were made illegal. The systematic destruction of identity, culture, language, family, and humanity was not incidental to the system. It was the system. You can't enslave a person that knows who they are. So they made sure people didn't know. This ran for 400 years. The records are a little fuzzy, but between 12 and 14 million people were stolen from Africa. Nearly 2 million died on the crossing. Tens of millions more were born into slavery in the Americas. The wealth generated by their labor built banking systems, the insurance industries, the textile industries, and the national economies of Britain, Spain, France, Portugal, the Netherlands, and the United States. That wealth was inherited, it was compounded. It is still here. When Britain abolished slavery in 1833, the government paid £20 million in compensation, equivalent to about £2 billion today. That money went to the enslavers, not to the enslaved. British taxpayers were paying off that debt until 2015. Lloyd's of London, which insured slave ships throughout the trade, they formally acknowledged the history and apologized for it. But the wealth didn't disappear. It compounded. The cotton that enslaved people picked in Mississippi in 1850, it built the textile industry that funded the Industrial Revolution. None of that wealth was ever returned. And when it was over, the men who built all of that wrote the history books. They named the streets after themselves, built monuments to the men that tried to keep it going, taught children that it was a tragedy of its time, something complicated, something to understand in context, you know? This week, 123 countries stood up at the United Nations and said, no, we see it, we name it, the gravest crime in the history of humanity. And I keep thinking about the people that never got to hear that. The people who died carrying the truth of this in their bodies, with the world's silence pressing down on top of it. Our ancestors knew exactly what it was. They lived it and the world looked away. That's not a small thing to finally name. Now let's talk about who refused to name it. 3 countries out of 193. The United States, Israel, and Argentina. 3 countries looked at a non-binding statement. Not a reparations check, not a court summons, not a single dollar changing hands, not one person facing any kind of consequences, just a formal moral acknowledgement that this happened and that it was the worst, and voted no. They voted no. And the argument this country made is one of the most clarifying things they've said in years. The U.S. Deputy Ambassador stood up in that hall and said, "The United States does not recognize a legal right to reparations for historical wrongs that were not illegal under international law at the time they occurred. They built the legal system that made all of that legal. They wrote those laws. They enforced them. They sent men with guns to drag the people back that survived long enough to escape. They fought a war. Hundreds of thousands of people died, specifically to keep those laws in place. And now they're sitting behind those same laws as their defense, as proof that they don't owe anything. The country that engineered the legal architecture of chattel slavery is using that same architecture like a shield. That's a confession if I've ever heard one. And then there's Europe. Europe didn't vote no. They abstained. And I want you to hear what Europe said in order to explain that. The European Union said that they couldn't support the resolution because the word gravest implies a hierarchy amongst atrocity crimes, and no legal hierarchy between crimes exists. The country that designed ships specifically engineered to maximize the number of human bodies that you could pack into a hull, that built the plantation economies that made European aristocratic families wealthy for 10 generations and counting, that colonized an entire continent and drew its borders at a conference in Berlin in 1884, where not a single African person was present, that extracted the gold, the diamonds, the rubber, the copper, the people for 100 years, and are still sitting with that wealth in 2026, had concerns about an adjective, not the 2 million people thrown into the ocean, not the women raped on those ships, not the children sold at auction, the word used to describe all of it. The Netherlands is the only country in the world that's ever formally apologized for its role in the slave trade. 1 out of every nation that participated. 1 apology in the entire history of the Western world. But look at who said yes, right? 132 countries, the entire African continent, the Caribbean, Latin America, most of Asia, the global south. The people who know from their blood and their bones what it means to be on the receiving end of that power. They didn't hesitate. They didn't debate language. They didn't have concerns about adjectives. They called it what it is without flinching, without qualifying, without apologizing for the clarity of it all. And for the first time in the history of international law, it's on the record. What happened to African people wasn't complicated. It wasn't a product of its time. It wasn't something we need to understand in context. It was the worst thing human beings have ever done to each other. 123 names on it. So let me be clear about what this week was and what it wasn't. It wasn't justice. It wasn't reparations. It wasn't accountability. No one's going to prison. No check is being written. No land is being returned. No wealth redistributed. It was 123 countries agreeing on a word, a non-binding word, and even then it was too much for some people. But that word, after 400 years of refusing to say it, is not nothing, because our ancestors carried the truth of this without anyone official ever confirming it. They knew what it was. We have always known what it is. And for generations, we were told we were exaggerating, that we needed to move on, that it was a long time ago, that people asking for acknowledgement were the problem. 3 countries said no, but 123 said yes. And the people who built this world on the bodies of our ancestors, who designed ships to fit more of them in, who rubbed oil on their skin to hide the damage before putting them on the auction block, who bred them like livestock and sold their children and raped their daughters, and then wrote history books calling it complicated, spent 400 years trying to make us forget that we were worth fighting for. This week, the world disagreed. That belongs to us. It always has. And nobody gets to take that back.